Hello everybody. Today we are discussing why I am a fraud and a liar and why my book should never be read by anyone. So the paperback edition of Why We're Getting Poorer is coming out and I've made some edits because there are a few minor errors that have come to my attention. Partially this was people pointing them out to me, partially these were things that I realized, but I thought I'd just go over them. So let's start with the most important one. It is where I misquote an episode of The Simpsons. So in the season 9 episode where Marge becomes an estate agent, there's a famous scene where Lionel Hutz explains to her the difference between the truth and the truth. Now, I quoted this scene extensively, and what I said Lionel Hutz said was, the right house is the one that's for sale, and the right buyer is the one who's looking. In fact, he said, the right house is the one that's for sale, and the right buyer is anyone. Terrible.
Listen, it's time I let you in on a little secret, Marge. The right house is the house that's for sale. The right person is anyone.
It gets even worse. I claim that Hutz says to Marge, a small house is cozy. A dilapidated house is a handyman's dream. In fact, he says, a small house is cozy. A dilapidated house is rustic.
That's dilapidated.
Rustic.
That house is on fire.
Motivated seller.
The handyman's dream is actually a quote from Marge, which she uses later on, and I misremembered Hutz as saying it.
The first house I have to show you is, a handyman's dream.
Continuing on the theme of misremembering TV shows. Now, some of you who are watching this may have seen my Downton Abbey and capitalism video. In the book, I kind of hinted at this before I'd made the video by saying that the pressures of the market economy and having to make money to survive, having to make land more productive, sell land off in order to make money to keep the estate running, those kinds of things befall the characters of Downton Abbey, and they are an indication of the spread of capitalism in Britain. I also mentioned the show Bridgerton, and I said in the book that the pressures that befell the two sets of characters were similar, as if Bridgerton also saw the spread of the market economy. But that's not really true. Having watched Bridgerton a little bit longer, unfortunately, I've seen that there isn't really much pressure from the market economy. In fact, the one time this kind of thing is mentioned, the characters seem kind of surprised.
The Fields by Ferry Hallow. I was thinking we might hold off on leasing them this year due to the hard frost.
I beg your pardon?
The frost hardens the soil, saps it of nutrients.
That is very well, but you requested my ring.
This does actually support my point more, because Bridgerton is set 100 years earlier than Downton Abbey. So you can see that the spread of the market economy is not as prevalent. The aristocracy is still living like aristocrats, not like capitalists. But it was worth correcting anyway. With books like this, you often find that there's a lot of problems with the references. I had quite a lengthy back and forth with the editors and people responsible for proofreading, people responsible for referencing, and some of them ended up just like out of whack. So on page 15, I claim that every £200 million in cuts to NHS spending ends up costing £1 billion later on. Now, this is true, and what I'm saying is it's like the if you fail to treat an infection, you might have a limb amputated down the line. Failing to spend on preventative care might end up in higher crisis care costs down the line. This is true, except that the reference that I put in was the Marmot review, which is about health equity in England. Now, it's a great review, but it's not relevant. It doesn't actually contain that claim in it. The actual reference is an article by Luke Allen on the Oxford University website. So I needed to correct that reference. Similarly, in chapter 4, which is on global poverty, there is a reference 55. Now, if you check the endnotes, you'll see that there is no reference 55. What's happened there is that there is an extra reference inserted in, with the result that everything from reference 43 is actually one too high. So you have to move them all down one to match up the references to where they should be in the text, if that makes sense. So that means that reference 43 should appear where reference 44 is, and then reference 44 should appear where reference 45 is, and so on until you get to reference 54 should appear where reference 55 is, and there should be no reference 55. So, again, editing, drafting, these things slip through. But if you've got one of the first editions of Why We're Getting Poorer, you might want to bear that in mind. In chapter 3, I review the debate between Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman, and they discuss the gender pay gap. She says that the average median wage for women is 9% lower in the UK than it is for men.
I mean, that 9% pay gap, that's a gap between median hourly earnings between men and women.
But there's
that exists.
Yeah, but there's multiple reasons for that. One of them is gender, but it's not the only reason. Like if you're a social scientist worth your salt, you never do a univariate analysis.
I reference a review by Blow and Kahn about the gender pay gap in the USA. And I say that after adjusting for like occupation and age and all these different things that Jordan Peterson says you need to adjust for, that Jordan Peterson says after you adjust for these things, there is no gender pay gap. When you do that, you still get a pay gap of 9%. Now, I note these two 9%, and I don't make it clear that they're different because one is in the UK, one is in the US. One is the average difference and the other is the adjusted difference. But I don't think it's that misleading, the text, but I feel like you could believe that they were the same statistics. So I've just edited it to make it clear that they're not. It was just a kind of weird coincidence that 9% was the exact figure she quoted and also appears in these more serious reviews. But again, different data. As another example of how I'm a British person who doesn't understand anything that happens outside of my country or maybe America, I called the economist/historian Karl Polanyi Polish. I said he was Polish twice. He was actually Austro-Hungarian. Now, I feel quite bad about that because Hungary doesn't really get any love in the book. As another example of how I don't know anything about other countries, in the section on housing, and specifically on rent control and renter protections, I talk about how Germany has a lot more people in rented accommodation. And that lots of Germans are quite happy with this because there are a lot of protections for Germans who rent their homes. And so they have no plan for buying, many of them. So home ownership, in the sense that we have it in a lot of countries, which actually means mortgage-based ownership, that's not as prevalent in Germany. And yet people are so secure in their dwellings that it doesn't really matter. This also has a bunch of weird implications for like wealth statistics because it makes wealth inequality in Germany look really bad, but that's just because very few people own their homes. So the people that own their homes look really, really wealthy in relative terms. But in terms of access to housing, Germany isn't very unequal. In fact, it's less unequal than most countries. Anyway, it's not about Germany. What I did, which is something that quite a few people do, I bracketed the Netherlands with Germany in this section. And I acted like the Netherlands has a similar approach to housing. This is wrong. This is just wrong. The Netherlands, if anything, has a more similar approach to the UK. They have a lot of mortgage-based ownership. There's a lot of debate over the cost of housing. It's a real problem. They're much closer to the UK or US than they are to Germany. But I think a lot of people believe that the Netherlands is kind of a mini Germany, and there's some truth in that. You know, they still have a more robust social safety net than the UK, right? Their austerity has been far less ambitious. They have higher taxes and higher spending. I do think they have more social cohesion and social obligations than the UK. They're not as hyper-capitalist. But on the other hand, they have quite a substantial financial sector and they struggle with wealth inequality. They have had some austerity and their housing market is financialized, inflated tale of two markets, right? Where some people just can't get on the housing ladder because the credit that's been lent out has bid up the price of houses so much. And that's really similar to the UK again. So it's kind of interesting that I drew an analogy there. I don't know what I was thinking. It's one of those things that just slipped through. Sorry to my Dutch followers. All right, so it looks like that was it. There are some other changes I've made to Why We're Getting Poorer for the paperback edition. I added a few facts in the introduction about the UK economy and GDP and stuff that I just don't know why they're not in there. I don't talk about the basic economic performance of the UK in that period for some reason, even though I'm reviewing it in every other respect. So I added a little bit there. Added a little bit more about intellectual property. I tweaked a couple of bits, but most importantly, many people commented that this book is split into 3 parts, and part 1 is 4 chapters long, part 2 is 4 chapters long, but part 3 is like 1 short chapter long, and people are like, why is it a part? I don't know, it kind of looked good, but what I've done is I've added 2 more short chapters to that. One is called Synthesizing Solutions, which is just about bringing together some of the main proposals within the book. There's basically, you could just put it down to tax and spend. But I am a great believer in progressive taxation. I'm a great believer in public investment, and I think we need to reclaim that. It's not everything. I talk a lot about economic democracy, which is the chapter in the conclusion that already exists, right? So that's there as well, like a more radical rethinking of the economy. So it's not just more sort of centralized state-driven tax and spend. But I do think it's worth underscoring those solutions, because some people have said there aren't solutions in the book, which I don't think is true if you read it properly, but I think you need to reaffirm and synthesize those things. The other added thing I've put is right at the end, which is just an afterword, because I finished writing this book in October 2024, just before Trump 2.0. Needless to say, there have been a lot of economic shenanigans then. There's been a lot of talk about K-shaped recoveries, where the economy seems to be growing, but only for the rich. There's been Trump's tariff policies and the chaos that that's caused. There's been Doge and the cuts to public expenditure and the attempted gutting of the federal government. I know Doge is disbanded now, but they did real damage. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how extreme levels of inequality really endanger the rest of the economy when these corrupt motherfuckers get elected. So that's what the afterwards about. If you haven't bought Why We're Getting Poorer, then, you know, the paperback's going to come out in like March. Or if you maybe listen to the audiobook, but you're like, oh, I could read it, and you'll get loads more out of it. But maybe wait till the paperback edition, because it's cheaper, it's smaller, and it's got a little bit more. And it doesn't have so many egregious errors. Misremembering a Simpsons episode. What am I even doing?